In spite of Adolf Hitler's demand at the beginning of March 1945 that the Allies find not one bridge left standing on the River Rhine to aid them in crossing the wide waterway, a remarkable coup by the US 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff railway bridge intact on the evening of the 7th. Although the German defenders had attempted demolition, the charges had failed to go off. Taking advantage of the situation, US troops had seized the bridge, and within hours General Hodges was packing his forces across. The German leader, incandescent with rage that his order had not been carried out, had the officers responsible for the debacle shot and demanded that Goering employ all of the Luftwaffe's resources to destroy the bridge forthwith. The Luftwaffe commander gave the destruction of the bridge the highest priority, even calling for volunteers to dive their aircraft into the structure. In spite of low cloud, the Luftwaffe flew many unsuccessful sorties. US anti-aircraft gunners found themselves firing on a diversity of enemy types, ranging from single-engined fighter bombers, like the FW-190, through to the most advanced aircraft in the fading Luftwaffe's inventory. Bomb-toting Me-262 jet fighters and Arado AR-234 jet bombers all attempted, albeit to no avail, to bring the bridge down. Within 24 hours of the bridge having been seized, Hodges' forces had carved out a bridgehead, feeding in no less than 8,000 troops and supporting armour from 9th Armoured and 78th Infantry Divisions. But orders from above now restricted the US advance to just 6 miles beyond the bridge to the Cologne-Frankfurt Autobahn. 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally succumbed and collapsed into the Rhine. It was, however, too late for the Germans, as the Americans already had a strong bridgehead in place and rapidly put across a pontoon replacement to feed even more forces across the river. In the meantime, the unforeseen opportunity offered by the bridge had led to controversy among the Allied High Command. Exploitation was passed over in favour of keeping to the long-planned assault across the Rhine to be undertaken towards the end of March under the command of Field Marshal Montgomery. On March the 23rd, Montgomery's 21st Army Group crossed the Rhine. Eisenhower now shifted the weight of the Allied advance into Germany from the northwest plain into central Germany. Believing that Berlin would be taken by the Soviets, Eisenhower reasoned that more worthwhile military objectives lay in central Germany and along the planned line of advance of the US Army, and Montgomery's advance was reduced to clearing northern Germany to the line of the Elbe. Having awaited Montgomery's crossing of the Rhine, Hodges' First Army broke out of the Remagen bridgehead on March the 25th and drove rapidly eastwards towards Myburg and Gießen. German resistance was weak. Although Kesselring, as German Commander West, disposed of some 60 divisions on paper, many were weak and morale was low. Opposition tended to be fitful, with only the occasional small battle group attempting to hold up the US advance, but these were rapidly pushed aside. Having detached 9th Army from Montgomery's command and placed it once more under Bradley's authority, General Simpson was ordered to break out of his bridgehead to the north of the Ruhr on March the 27th and drive eastwards towards Munster, capturing the towns of Bochum and Hamm en route. Simpson's 9th Army and Hodges' 1st Army were thus the northern and southern pincers of General Omar Bradley's plan to encircle the German Army Group B in the Ruhr. So rapid was the US advance and so ineffectual the German opposition that the leading tank units of the two US armies made contact at Lippstadt just before daylight on April the 1st. Netted within the pocket were 7 German corps and 19 divisions. Many small towns and villages along the route of the advance surrendered to the US forces. The local police and authorities were quick to offer assistance to the advancing Americans to spare their villages and towns from destruction. Many German soldiers gave themselves up, and the remarkable contrast in the ages of those taken into captivity is the measure of how grave the manpower situation in Germany was in 1945. The trawl of prisoners included boys of 14 and old men in their 50s. General George S. Patton's Third Army broke out of its bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine at Oppenheim and, with 12th Corps in the van, advanced rapidly to the northeast. The River Main was spanned with a pontoon bridge, and on March the 28th, elements of the 4th Armoured Division began to cross. Making thereafter for Hanau, it later joined up with 1st Army at Gießen. Eisenhower's plan called for 1st, 3rd and 9th Armies to drive eastward, even before the final reduction of the Ruhr pocket, in order to capture Leipzig and Dresden. This would not only cut Germany in two, but would also result in the occupation of the last remaining industrial region of the Reich. Patch's 7th Army and the French 1st Army were to advance into southern Germany to the south of the River Main. Rumours of a final stand in the Alps would later modify this plan. When on April the 18th the last German forces within the 80-mile-wide Ruhr pocket surrendered, the Americans were staggered at the vast quantity of material captured and at the huge number of prisoners that finally passed into captivity. No fewer than 317,000 were taken, a figure greater than at the fall of Tunisia or at Stalingrad. The fight had gone out of the Germans once it was realized that continued resistance was not delaying the US drive across Germany. Model, however, took the view that surrender was not an honourable course open to him or his army, but wishing to avoid unnecessary suffering to his men, now that the war was lost, he dissolved his command in order to resolve the impasse, thereby releasing his men from military authority. In consequence, many thousands surrendered to the Americans on a daily basis. One US soldier at Wuppertal started out with 68 prisoners under his charge and arrived at the prisoner of war cage overseeing a total of 1,200. Although General Matthew Ridgway had attempted to secure the surrender of the German Field Marshal, the latter would have none of it. He had publicly heaped derision on von Paulus when he'd surrendered at Stalingrad. He was not about to do the same. On April the 21st, he walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. Unable to properly process or house such an immense number of prisoners, the Americans reverted to simply placing barbed wire around fields and employing them as temporary stockades. Some old soldiers among them were now living through Germany's second lost war in a generation. In the wake of the advancing armies came the troops and bodies responsible for bringing order to a German civilian populace attempting to eke out some sort of life amid such destruction. For the people of the cities of the Ruhr, the US occupation marked the end of nearly 5 years of intensive night and day bombing by RAF and US aircraft, which had reduced the whole of Germany's premier industrial region and powerhouse for its war machine to one vast ruin. Rumbling through the streets of the shattered towns and cities in the wake of the battle for the Ruhr was an endless line of vehicles and tank transporters carrying the supplies and equipment forward to the rapidly advancing spearheads. Ammunition, petrol, oil and lubricants were needed in vast quantities, the very sinews of modern warfare and the logistic tail without which no army can fight. Among the many types of vehicles to be seen are ubiquitous jeeps, Studebaker and GMC 2 6x6 general-purpose lorries, Dodge 214 recce cars, an M26 Dragon wagon, and a Diamond T heavy tank transporter carrying an M4 Sherman. Although the US Army Air Force continued to send its fighters aloft during this period, Luftwaffe opposition was becoming a much rarer sight. P-51D Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Squadron are seen patrolling high over Germany at this time. The aircraft in the foreground, carrying the name Down for Double and Ace of Spades playing card, is flown by Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Graham, an ace with 7 air kills and 9.5 ground victories to his credit. This squadron was part of the 355th Fighter Group, the third highest scoring in the 8th Air Force. Occasionally, even at this stage of the conflict, sorties would be flown by surviving enemy fighters. Caught on this colour gun film is a late model FW190D9, which is being hounded to destruction by a P-51. Under such conditions of almost total air superiority, very few propeller-driven Luftwaffe fighters survived. An M18 Hellcat fast tank destroyer emerges from smoke, to be followed by a number of infantry-laden M3 half-tracks as the US advance across central Germany gains momentum. Hodges' First Army had been given the principal role in this thrust. By April the 4th, he'd linked up with units of Third Army, which had swung up from the south to meet him at Kassel. Patton's orders were to maintain his advance east, but to the south of Hodges, with a view to driving on and through Erfurt, Weimar and Jena to secure the industrial city of Chemnitz. To the north of Hodges' line of advance, Simpson's First Army was pushing eastwards across the historic Teutoburger Wald, where the Germans had hoped to make some sort of stand. Along the routes of all three armies, the soldiers were greeted by the same sight of surrendering villages and towns, white sheets and flags clearly visible. Groups of dispirited and forlorn German soldiers, many having thrown away their weapons, were to be seen plodding westward to surrender and hand themselves over. For the leading US tankers driving hell for leather across the flat terrain, it was a question not of stopping, but of simply directing them to the rear, where they would be dealt with in due course. Under the code name of the Zebra mission, 20 new T-26E3 Pershing tanks were shipped post-haste to Europe in 1945 for combat trials. This heavy tank was urgently requested as the Sherman tank had been shown to be severely wanting in the face of the German Tiger and Panther tanks. Even when upgunned to carry the long-barreled 76mm gun in the new T-23 turret, as is seen on these three late production cast-hulled M4A1s, the Sherman was still unable to penetrate the frontal armour of these two German panzers. The Shermans also carry improvised frontal armour added in the field to give some further measure of protection. For all its limitations, the Sherman was nevertheless a remarkable fighting machine. While it could not match the German Tiger or Panther in gunpowder or armour, it was far more reliable and faster than either. Nor was the lack of gunpowder, originally believed by the US Army to have been a major disadvantage in the design, because US Army tank doctrine had never envisaged that the Sherman would be employed to fight other tanks. That task was to be left to the specialized tank destroyer formations equipped by the specially developed N-10 armed with a 3-inch gun, and later M36, which mounted a 90mm gun. The role of the Sherman was deemed to be that of part of a manoeuvring force to support infantry and operate as mobile fire support to help effect the destruction of enemy strongpoints. The role in which it is seen in this film is exactly that envisaged for it by the US Army, that of the rapid exploitation of the enemy's front. When introduced in 1942, the Sherman was as good as any other medium tank in the world. Its continual updating and refinement, allied to the incredible production in the US, amounting to over 40,000 by war's end, a figure greater by a substantial margin than all of Germany's tank output during the conflict, meant that it could see effective service through to the war's end and beyond. The chassis of the M4 also proved highly adaptable and was used as the basis of the later variant of the M7 Priest self-propelled gun that was used to support operations by tank formations. All US Army medium tank units employed just the Sherman, mainly in its M4, M4A1 and M4A3 variants. Most M4A2s and M4A4s were supplied as Lend-Lease machines to the British and Soviets. Even though the Germans referred to the M4 as the Ronson lighter, it was nevertheless the machine spearheading the US Army's final destruction of the once vaunted Wehrmacht. Emerging as the premier US fighter bomber and ground attack aircraft of the European campaign, Republic's P-47 Thunderbolt was extensively employed to assist the advance of the US ground forces into Germany. Armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns and able to carry bombs and rockets, the Thunderbolt was, along with the British Typhoon, simply known to the Germans as Yabo, one of the hated fighter bombers that always seemed to be there. Those taking off here are early Model D Razorbacks. Although available to service specific requests for support from the ground forces, the P-47s would fly from forward operating bases near to the front and engage on wide-ranging strafing missions behind enemy lines that would, in effect, target anything that moved along the roads and railway lines. This group of late model P-47Ds, identifiable by their bubble canopies and cut-down rear fuselage, in contrast to those seen earlier in this sequence, are flying on such a mission. In the absence of Luftwaffe opposition, these sorties could be undertaken virtually at will. And as the gun camera footage seen here testifies, the effect of all 8 machine guns firing on a target was highly dramatic and extremely destructive. The result of this devastating tactical air power was to virtually paralyze the movement of any daylight supply columns and transport. A major obstacle in the way of the advance of all 3 armies was the River Weser, which was bridged by 9th Army on the 5th of April. An M8 Greyhound armoured car precedes a dozer-equipped M4 Sherman across the pontoon bridge built by the engineers. This is followed by 2 examples of the new M24 Chaffee light recce tank, designed to replace the dangerously obsolescent M5 light tank. The M24 was a fine design and saw much service post-war. Resistance by the Germans tended to be sporadic. A small camper group of die-hard Waffen-SS soldiers, along with Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, would attempt to delay the US forces by fighting it out in a village that had been prepared for defense. The first German prisoners are seen running with hands up as they are herded towards the rear of the column. M4s of different marks are seen creating a gun line. The Shermans continue firing on positions in the village, and it is quickly covered by a pall of smoke from exploding shells. Infantry then advance into the village, past hastily made anti-tank obstacles constructed from tree trunks and telegraph poles supported by iron girders. One of the most feared German weapons was the one-man handheld anti-tank rocket known as the Panzerfaust. An M4A3 has just been hit by one of these hollow charge weapons. Other Shermans passed the burning and blackened hulk, no doubt giving a thought for the crew who probably died in their tank. The Panzerfaust could penetrate the armour of any Allied tank with little difficulty. These Shermans now find themselves involved in yet more combat. A late model M4A3E8, better known to their users as the Easy 8, employs its turret-mounted machine gun to suppress enemy fire. Artillery support is given by the crew of an M7 Priest, who use their 105mm howitzer to bombard the German positions. The large number of rounds fired off by these SPs goes to show the importance of rapid resupply from the rear. After the initial firefight, the US troops enter the town, taking advantage of the cover given by an M5 light tank. The fact that the soldiers have mainly shouldered their weapons and are casually walking through the town suggests that the enemy resistance has been cleared. The surrounding devastation is hardly the product of the ground forces. This is clearly a town that has been heavily bombed by Allied aircraft. With the Luftwaffe virtually absent from the skies, resupply of the fast-moving columns with troops and supplies from the air was possible. The premier Allied transport throughout the conflict in the European and Pacific theatres was the remarkable Douglas C-47 Dakota. Although the last major drop of paratroops came during Operation Veritable, the crossing of the Rhine by 21st Army Group in March, smaller drops of the sort seen here were frequent. While the paratroops jumped from within the aircraft, the supply containers are carried under the mid-fuselage of the C-47 and were released by the crew. By April the 11th, forces belonging to 9th Army had reached the Elbe at Magdeburg, within striking distance of Berlin. However, Eisenhower had already decided against a drive on the city. Farther south, 1st Army reached Dessau on the Elbe on the 24th of April after heavy fighting. 3rd Army bypassed Leipzig and reached the river at Colditz, and US infantry of the 69th Division captured the city. Much of Leipzig lay in ruins following the extensive bombing over the previous 3 years due to its importance as the centre of major war industries. Moving westward from eastern Germany were hordes of fearful refugees escaping from the advance of the Red Army, which was itself now moving rapidly towards the line of the Elbe. US soldiers are seen searching the belongings of surrendering German troops and examining identity cards. The large numbers of German prisoners taken west of the river were also being swelled by those from units escaping from the east and Soviet captivity. The vast multitude of German POWs was beginning to place a great strain on the US Army, and longer-term plans would be needed to properly accommodate and screen the hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht troops. Countless foreign workers from France and the Low Countries and hundreds of Allied prisoners, many held since the French campaign in 1940, clearly expressed their great joy at being released by the advancing American forces. At the same time, Patton's army reached Colditz and liberated over 1,800 of the most troublesome Allied prisoners of war. French tricolours were raised aloft as the jubilant freed prisoners marched through the streets of Leipzig, a scene that was being repeated all over Germany as Allied forces liberated soldiers, many of whom had been behind the wire for over 5 years. On the 25th of April, the northern and southern pincers of the Soviet assault forces attacking Berlin completed their encirclement of the German capital. Less than 100 miles away to the southeast on the same day, the first meeting took place between the forces of the US Army and the Red Army. In a subsequent Russian report, Marshal Ivan Koniev, commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front, stated that the first contact had been made at 13:30 hours by forces of the 58th Guards Rifle Division from the 5th Guards Army, with a recce detachment from the US 69th Infantry Division at Strela. This was followed by a second meeting when Captain Nieder of the 173rd Guards Rifle Regiment linked up with another US Army patrol at Torgau. However, the official link-up of the two allies, as seen here, occurred at 4:40 p.m. when a patrol led by Lieutenant William D. Robinson of the 69th Infantry Division met more Soviet soldiers at Torgau. The event and subsequent low-key celebrations were filmed by American and Soviet cameramen for the domestic cinema and presented as the event that represented the cleaving of Nazi Germany in two. The subsequent fraternization between the armies of the two powers was nevertheless short-lived, even though the sentiments expressed by those who took part was no doubt genuine. Officer banter gave way to a cheerful dance with Red Army and US Army personnel whiling away the summer evening under the watchful eye of Joseph Stalin. On a more martial note, a US general was given the opportunity to view a Red Army T-3485 in close-up. There can be little doubt that much interest was shown by the Americans in this superb Soviet tank. Indeed, within 5 years, US Shermans would be facing these Soviet machines in fierce and heavy fighting on the bare hills of Korea in a new war in Asia. General Deva's 6th Army Group, comprising of Patch's 7th Army and 1st French Army, were tasked with covering the right flank of Patton's 3rd Army to its north. Although the French were powerfully motivated, they were not so well equipped, and Devers knew he would need to provide them with assistance. The fear of a German stand in the Alps also drew his forces southwards towards Bavaria. It was to lance the possibility of a national redoubt that, on April 12th, Eisenhower and Bradley diverted Patton's army southwards to assist Devers. US forces in southern Germany found themselves facing strong enemy resistance. By this period of the war, many US Army Shermans had been equipped with improvised protection to compensate for the vulnerability of the thin armour of the M4 in the face of high-velocity German anti-tank weapons. Welded frames were attached to the turret and hull by engineers in the field to carry sandbags. This particular dozer and sandbag-equipped Sherman carries the standard 75mm M3 tank gun. Although having their Sherman covered by sandbags may have given the crew some degree of reassurance, it is questionable whether they were effective. The heavily bombed city of Nuremberg was finally captured on April the 20th after a heavy fight against a determined opposition. 2 German army divisions, assisted by Volkssturm, Luftwaffe detachments and a small panzer force, employed the large number of heavy anti-aircraft guns that ringed the city to put up a fierce resistance. The 88 and 105mm guns were used to deadly effect against the attacking American armour. While 2 divisions of 15th Corps assaulted the city from the northwest, another from 21st Corps advanced into the western suburbs, while a fast mobile group cut off the southern exits. Combat engineers had a hectic job constructing temporary bridges to replace the many bombed-out spans that crossed the waterways through the city. 6x6 2.5-ton lorries lead a Dodge weapons carrier across one of the bridges. Most important of the artillery towing vehicles produced for the US Army was the M5 high-speed tractor, which is seen here crossing a bridge in Nuremberg towing a 155mm howitzer, the standard heavy field howitzer of the US forces. It's followed by an M16 half-track armed with 4.50 caliber guns for use in the anti-aircraft role. For a few hours in the wake of the capture of Nuremberg on April the 20th, US troops take time out to relax in the Nuremberg Stadium, wherein Hitler held the great Nazi Party rallies during the 1930s. It was from the position on the dais taken up by the jazz band that the German leader had addressed the assembled throng of the party faithful and espoused the political creed that would plunge the world into war in September 1939. There were no doubt a few soldiers among those present who would have grasped the irony. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich brought down after just 12 years and symbolized by the US Army's occupation of the spiritual home of the Nazi regime. With Germany cut in two, most raids by US heavy bombers took place against targets in the south of the country, Austria and Czechoslovakia. The 19th of April had seen the final encounter of B-17s with enemy jet fighters. B-26 Marauder medium bombers were also operating against targets in this region right up to the surrender, and were able to testify that the teeth of the Luftwaffe were not yet fully drawn, even at this late stage. Between the 20th and the 26th of April, B-26s of the 17th, 322nd, 323rd and 334th bombardment groups found themselves involved in running fights and suffering losses to the Me-262s of JV-44 flying out of Munich Riem Air Base. A shot-up Hetzer light tank destroyer lies mute and abandoned on the side of the road, in all probability the victim of a roving ground-strafing P-47 Thunderbolt, and is passed by a Jeep and M3 half-track of a reconnaissance detachment. Operating in advance of the armoured spearhead, the vehicles pass through a seemingly deserted village and make their way to their destination, an abandoned airfield. They pass a section of the fuselage of a destroyed Junkers Ju-88G night fighter, which still clearly bears the special camouflage scheme carried by such aircraft. Parts of the airfield have been put to the torch by its former occupants. On many such airfields, vast numbers of Luftwaffe aircraft were found abandoned. Pulling back from a gun line of Shermans are two of the 20 M26 Pershings to see service in Germany before the end of the war. The US tankers were highly appreciative of the new machine's heavy armour and powerful and accurate 90mm gun, which could deal with a Tiger I. Allocated to the 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions, the Pershing first saw action with the former 10 days before the capture of the bridge at Remagen. Of the 20 sent for combat testing, only one did not finish the war on active service, having been knocked out by an 88mm gun of a Nashorn tank destroyer in the fighting around Cologne. Shermans were frequently employed by the US Army in the direct fire role as artillery. On this occasion, M4A3s and EZ8s are using their 75mm and long-barreled 76mm guns to bombard a village in which a German unit has decided to fight it out. Understandably, at this stage of the war, this seemed a much more preferable way of dealing with the occasional pockets of die-hard enemy soldiers. Tanks belonging to the 11th Armoured Division and part of Patton's 3rd Army ford the River Muhl near Neufelden in Austria on the 4th of May during their advance on the city of Linz. It provides an excellent opportunity to view the makeup of such a formation in the last few days of the war. Late model M4A3s with the 47-degree hull front and armed with the 75mm gun are used by the accompanying infantry to hitch a ride over the very cold river, which is still flowing strongly because of the snow melt from the mountains. Next across is an M26 Pershing, which is also used as an impromptu personnel carrier. Being heavier than the Sherman, more care is being taken in getting the M26 up onto the bank to ensure it does not collapse under the tank's weight. In order to help the passage of the armour and support vehicles across the river, a wall has been demolished to permit the bricks to be thrown into the mud and give the tracks of the tanks and SPs a degree of traction as they emerge from the river. M7 Priests and M4s are seen crossing in this particular sequence. Following on are numerous 2.5-ton lorries carrying supplies to sustain the advance, which continues once the river is crossed, with the armour taking advantage of a road to build up speed. Seen here is the M4A3, a most important US Army variant of the Sherman. The 47-degree hull front and wet stowage was carried over into the M4A3E8, the last variant. It was equipped with a new suspension, track and turret which mounted a long-barreled 76mm gun and saw much service after the war. Although the formal surrender of German forces has yet to take place, it's apparent that for these soldiers going into captivity at the beginning of May, the war is as good as over. They already know that Hitler is dead, although the radio announcement that he died fighting alongside his troops against the Russians in Berlin was not yet known to have been a lie. With so many German troops surrendering, the US Army was hard-placed to secure them all. Engineer units were frequently delegated to erect temporary holding areas for enemy prisoners, pending the setting up of more permanent establishments. By the beginning of May, many German units simply raised the white flag and handed themselves over to the US Army en masse. Their immediate fate was a space in a field open to the elements. Meanwhile, the spearhead of Patton's 3rd Army had crossed the Austrian border on the 1st of May. Enemy resistance was rapidly melting away, with the German commander, Field Marshal Kesselring, retreating to Berchtesgaden. While other elements moved to secure the towns of Passau and Branau, the 11th Armoured Division drove on to Linz, entering the city on May the 5th. Once more, the scene was dominated by prisoners, and the city square became the assembly point for hundreds of surrendering German troops who were either marched or brought in by lorry. The variety of shades of grey in the uniforms points to soldiers who served in the army and Luftwaffe, as well as the Volkssturm. Although the US troops seem quite relaxed, tanks and M3 half-tracks are seen spread out around the square, providing a degree of security as the German troops are sorted, then marched out to begin their captivity. Most of the Shermans are of the later M4A3 variant equipped with a 76mm gun, and there are also a number of the EZ8s present. Like many of the towns of southern Bavaria and Austria, Linz shows no evidence of war damage. Because the town had no significant war industries, it was spared the bombing other Austrian cities had visited upon them. Linz was the town that Hitler had expressed the desire to retire to after the war and take up painting once more. The architecture had always appealed to him, and he had grand visions of remodeling it in accordance with his own ideas and taste. Clutching bags containing what few belongings they're allowed to retain, the German prisoners are marched off under guard. The long column moves past the crew of an M3 half-track, the gunner sitting on the machine gun ring with the heavy .50 caliber weapon to hand. Marching out of town, it passes another guard Sherman, an M4A3 with a 47-degree hull front. The olive drab colour scheme has been extensively lightened by a heavy layer of dust. With the German capitulation on May the 7th, there begins the formal process of surrender by the surviving German forces. As Linz marked the southernmost point reached by Patton's men, and as the US forces here were in close proximity to Soviet forces in Austria, many of the German units presenting themselves to US Army were escaping from the Russians. As officers formally greet each other and vehicles move forward nose to tail, every available vehicle that could move, including numerous bicycles, have been brought into use. US soldiers manning the roadblocks received the surrender of sidearms from the German troops. While a few Austrian ladies attempt to fraternize with the US troops, an immense pile of surrendered enemy equipment is made by the roadside and includes such items as pistols, rifles, machine pistols, gas mask containers, steel helmets and identification flags. Elements of Patton's Third Army entered Czechoslovakia on May the 6th. Patton had been itching to get into the country for the previous 2 weeks, but Eisenhower and Bradley were concerned about the Russians who were already fighting there. When the latter asked Patton why the Third Army was so concerned to liberate Czechoslovakia, he replied saying, "On to Czechoslovakia and fraternization." An agreement with the Russians was reached whereby the US advance would fall short of Prague, which was to be liberated by the Red Army. Hübner's 5th Corps was received with great enthusiasm by the natives in its advance on Carlsbad, Pilsen and České Budějovice. Here a column of M24 Chaffee light tanks are seen entering Pilsen to the acclaim of its citizens. Pilsen had been under German rule since 1938. However, the enthusiasm of the Czech crowds and the pleasure of liberation would soon be tempered by the reality of Soviet occupation. Marching through Pilsen and into captivity is the command, staff and troops of the German 7th Army, which had been displaced into Czechoslovakia by the rapid advance of Patton's Third Army southwards into Austria some weeks before. Dotted all over Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia were immense dumps of abandoned German military equipment. That scene here is mainly composed of softskins, but there are a few identifiable late-model SD KFZ 250 one-ton half-tracks. Many of the lorries are Opel, Mercedes, Bussing and Tatra manufacture. While many are straight load carriers, there are a number of more specialized adaptations. A rarity among the junk lorries are 3 Puma 8-wheeled armored cars, only a small number of which were manufactured in 1944. The most difficult problem now facing the US Army in the aftermath of the final surrender on May the 7th was that of dealing with the increased number of prisoners. All over the roads of southern Germany and the US-occupied areas of Czechoslovakia, long columns of prisoners snaked along roads as they were herded into temporary stockades and holding camps. With the virtual breakdown of the infrastructure within Germany, the Allied powers had to assume responsibility for supplying not just the needs of the civilian populace, but also of the surrendered military, whose numbers ran into the hundreds of thousands. Not surprisingly, the provision of such stretched the Allied logistical systems to the limit. While that of the US Army was well organized and provided for, even this situation posed a problem of a totally unique kind. One of the first tasks was to have many of the German troops shifted away from the temporary holding areas, near areas in close proximity to the Red Army, and move them into camps deeper within the US Army's area of admin within Germany. In Austria and Czechoslovakia, the desire of so many German units to escape from captivity under the Soviets had caused problems. Some German units in particular had good reason not to want to fall into Soviet hands. Waffen-SS formations and other units who had spent much time serving on the Eastern Front were deemed by the Red Army to be rightfully theirs to take prisoner. A good example was that of Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring Luftwaffe ace of the war and of all time, with 352 aircraft to his credit, all Russian. On May the 8th, Hartmann and many others serving in JG-52 had surrendered to the US 90th Infantry Division at Písek in Czechoslovakia. 8 days later, he and many of his comrades, and accompanying women and children, were handed over to the Russians. Hartmann spent the next 10 years as a prisoner in Russia. The movement of thousands of POWs in exercises like this were to be repeated on a regular basis all over the British, French and US sectors of Germany. In eastern Germany, the holding pens near operating railways were emptied of their prisoners as soon as trains were available to transport them back to Russia. Vast numbers of German POWs who surrendered in the east were deported back to the Gulag, where those that survived returned to Germany from 1950 onwards. One other reason for this transport of prisoners was the need to concentrate them so that the Allied authorities could begin the process of screening them. Long lists had already been prepared of individuals belonging to the Nazi Party, the SS and the Wehrmacht, whom the Allies wished to find. Others whom had special skills or expertise were also trawled from within the POW camps. Günter Rahl, another high-ranking Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories to his credit, was to recall after the war how he escaped the massive open-air camp at Heilbronn near Heidelberg. The commander of the camp appeared one morning and read out a list of names that included his own. He first thought it covered only highly decorated pilots. He later discovered that the US authorities wanted to lay hands on all pilots with experience of flying the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. He was asked if he wished to go to America, which he later did. In due course, he became commander of the new post-war Luftwaffe. Other specialists were also sorted out, those who had worked on other prestige military projects, such as the V-1 and V-2 rockets. The currency in knowledge among the defeated was already acquiring great value with the victors, as within days of the end of the war, the once former allies in West and East began to distance themselves from one another. The fate for the majority of German POWs in the immediate aftermath of the surrender was not pleasant. Many found themselves herded into huge penned-in areas occupying many acres of ground devoid of any cover or facilities. At night they lay in the open air, and many succumbed to illness and disease. While much can be laid at the door of the difficulty in dealing with such vast numbers of prisoners, it is also true to say that in the light of the discovery of the darker side of Nazi Germany, there were many on the Allied side who saw in their situation a rightful punishment for the regime's crimes. The capture of Salzburg and Berchtesgaden and the entrances to the mountain passes by the US 15th Corps effectively ended any possibility of a final Nazi stand in the national redoubt of the Alps. Berchtesgaden itself had been spared the ravages of war and still retained its picturesque pre-war postcard image. However, its proximity to Hitler's mountain retreat at the Elbe Salzburg saw the valleys around the town reverberate to the sound of exploding bombs just days before the arrival of the US Army. On April the 26th, RAF Bomber Command unleashed a daylight attack by a force of Lancaster heavy bombers directed at the destruction of Hitler's private retreat in its last major bombing raid of the war. Although heavy anti-aircraft fire was encountered from batteries protecting the site, the damage inflicted was extensive, as is clearly witnessed by this film and the US soldiers exploring the ruins. Bombing was focused on the SS Guards and Control Center, the Eagle's Nest and Hitler's Chalet. The latter was well known, having been seen in many newsreels as the place where Hitler had personally welcomed many foreign dignitaries and politicians before and during the war. Film of him relaxing there also showed the presence of many of the other leading figures of the regime in attendance, such as Goering, Bormann, Goebbels, Himmler and Speer. Indeed, a number kept their own chalets nearby. Goering had left Berlin and travelled down to stay in his chalet on the Obersalzberg in the days before the fall of Berlin and the final German surrender. Hitler had been particularly proud of the very large windowed view from the main hall across to the mountains, and was frequently photographed in this room. American soldiers now take advantage to stand in the remains of the room where history was made and peer out of the hole where the great picture window had stood until blown out on April the 26th. Subsequently, the Berghof was demolished and little now remains on the site. Although he had been a distinctly lesser figure in the Third Reich for some time, the capture by the US Army of Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering on May the 7th undoubtedly netted the best known of the leading Nazis after Hitler himself. Goering's conviction that Eisenhower would wish to speak with him was rapidly punctured, and in the days that followed, his prime concern seemed to be that, at the very last, Hitler had denied him and instead appointed Admiral Dönitz as his successor. When, on May the 20th, he was flown to Luxembourg to be interned along with other leading figures of the Reich, a confidential report sent by one of his interrogators warned that Goering was not to be underrated and should not be regarded as a comic figure. His appearance and manner disguised a still cool and calculating mind, as was revealed when on trial at Nuremberg, where he emerged as a most formidable defendant. Other than that of Rommel, the names of only a few German generals were known to the public in the USA and Great Britain during the course of the war. One of these was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and he was both portrayed and seen by many on the Allied side as the archetype of the Prussian officer in the German army. Indeed, he was the senior officer in that service during the conflict. He was nevertheless anything but sympathetic to the Nazis and made his feelings about Hitler, whom he called the Bohemian Corporal, known to more than a few around him. Sacked and frequently recalled by Hitler, he was by 1945 old and worn out. He was captured on May the 2nd and is seen here being taken into captivity. In 1948 he was indicted for war crimes by a British military court, but served just 1 year. He died in 1953. Smiling Albert Kesselring, while a Luftwaffe Field Marshal, held numerous commands. He was the second man to serve as Luftwaffe Chief of Staff. He also commanded air fleets in the first years of the war, was the senior German commander in the Mediterranean, and oversaw the German campaign in Italy. His final command was of the forces defeated by the US Army in Germany in March-May 1945, and was captured in Berchtesgaden on May the 15th. When appointed to the office of Inspector General of Fighters in December 1941, Adolf Galland was already a well-known fighter ace with 94 officially confirmed victories and Geschwader commander. From then until December 1944, when he was unceremoniously sacked by Goering, he attempted to organize and best use the Luftwaffe's fighter arm against impossibly growing demands. Galland became Goering's scapegoat for the inability of the fighter arm to defeat the Allied bombing campaign over Germany. Still wearing his uniform of Generalleutnant and his Knight's Cross with swords and diamonds, he's seen here with his US interrogator, Major Max Rosendorm of the United States Army Air Force. In the best tradition of fighter pilots everywhere, they used their hands to do much of the talking, and the subject of their conversation was the ME-262 and JV-44, the elite jet fighter unit commanded by Galland from January until war's end. Oberst Hans Ulrich Rudel fell into American hands, despite being wanted by the Russians, who'd been the primary victims of his remarkable destructive expertise. This flyer's record was unique. He emerged from the war as the most highly decorated of all servicemen in the Wehrmacht, and the most highly decorated flyer of all time. His career in Russia was inextricably bound up with his favoured aerial mount, the Ju-87 Stuka. By war's end, he had flown 2,000-plus sorties and had destroyed over 500 Soviet tanks in his cannon-armed Ju-87G. He even flew again after losing his lower right leg in early 1945 and was the only recipient of the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves and diamonds. He's seen here along with Galland and other high-ranking Air Force and Army officers prior to boarding a US Army Air Force C-47 transport, which flew them all to England on May the 14th for much longer in-depth interrogations and debriefing. Rudel declined to renounce his Nazi sympathies after the war and became involved in right-wing politics in Western Germany. He died in 1982. In the weeks following the German surrender, the US camera team responsible for this film travelled to Berlin and were on hand to record the British ceremony honouring Marshal Georgy Zhukov for his unique contribution to the defeat of Germany. British troops are drawn up in full parade order and await the arrival of the reviewing officer. Arriving in his staff car to make the formal presentation to the Soviet Deputy Supreme Commander against the dramatic backdrop of the shell-pocked columns of the Brandenburg Gate was Great Britain's leading soldier, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Neither man had met the other, but both had high profiles within the Allied nations. Zhukov's command now included his role as Soviet representative on the Allied Control Council for Germany. Following his review of the drawn-up British Honour Guard, Zhukov and his staff proceed past a line of drawn-up and specially painted bronze-green Cromwell tanks. No doubt a critical eye was passed over this example of British armour. Montgomery now made the formal investiture of Zhukov into the ranks of the Knights Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, the award being symbolised by the bright red sash worn by Zhukov as he stands to attention for the formal parade, having taken a final salute from his British opposite number. Between the central pillars of the Brandenburg Gate can be seen the huge picture of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, placed in such a fashion as to clearly make the point that it was here that the Soviet sector of the former capital of Nazi Germany began. The gate had itself been the focus of heavy fighting in the final days of the battle for Berlin, as had the Reichstag building. A rusty 88mm flak gun symbolises the lost battle for the German capital. The Reichstag building had been the object of particular Soviet attention in the final days of the battle for Berlin, as it had become the place for the last-ditch defence of the city. The assault on the building had begun on the 30th of April with an artillery bombardment and Katyusha rocket salvos. The building was then stormed by the 380th, the 574th, and 756th Infantry Regiments. More than 5,000 SS, Hitler Youth and Volkssturm fought the attackers. It took 2 days for the Reichstag to be cleared before the red flag was raised over the building as a symbol of the triumph of the Soviet Union. Completed only in 1939, the Reich Chancellery had been designed and built for Hitler by his court architect, later Minister for War Production, Albert Speer. It too was now a ruin and had also been the scene of heavy fighting. The building had been envisaged by Hitler and Speer as the first stage in what would have been the complete rebuilding of the centre of the city to make it more fitting as the capital of a thousand-year Reich that the German dictator dreamed would extend from the Atlantic to the Urals. Amidst the ruins of the once splendid Kurfürstendamm are the remains of the great Kaiser Wilhelm Church. This main thoroughfare leading to the Brandenburg Gate, once the premier street of the capital, is now reduced to rubble, as is most of Berlin. As the camera pans down the frontage of the shattered buildings, it is still possible to pick out the names of hotels, shops and theatres that made the Kudamm famous for shopping and nightlife. Even in the first weeks after the surrender, the local populace are making an effort to attend to the vast amount of devastation that lies around them. Work teams pulled together to retrieve and stack bricks. By such means was a start made on rebuilding the city, and it's noticeable that those participating in this work are almost all women and children. Most men were either prisoners, dead, or old and infirm. There were very few young German males on the streets of Berlin in July 1945. A flight over the city provides ample testimony to the immense destruction wrought on the former capital of Nazi Germany by 3 years of intensive aerial bombing by the RAF by night and the US 8th Air Force by day. Added to this was the battle for Berlin in April and May 1945 and the Russian capture of the city that further added to the immense devastation caused to the German capital. Very few buildings can be seen still in a habitable state, but most are empty shells. Nevertheless, it was rapidly becoming apparent that Berlin was already becoming a vital pawn in the new emergent antagonism developing between Russia and her former allies, the United States, Great Britain and France. In a real sense, Hitler was the architect of the Grand Alliance that had brought those four uneasy powers together in a common cause to bring about the destruction of Nazi Germany. Once the German dictator had been removed from the scene, the old ideological rivalries, fears and suspicions re-emerged very quickly. It is fitting, therefore, that the last image should focus on the Brandenburg Gate. At once the symbol of a defeated Germany and, for the 50 years after 1945, the symbol of the iron divide that separated Europe in a new, albeit cold, war.